The first section of the test lays out the basic differences in the classical civilizations. So you got the Greeks, which is Athens and Sparta. They came along earlier, and remember we studied that Athens was more education and philosophy, while Sparta was more of a warrior society. The Romans, on the other hand, come along after, because the legend is that Rome is founded by Romulus and Remus, who escaped the Trojan War. They come along later than Greece, and while we still see a lot of influence in Roman architecture from the Greeks, there's a few buildings in Rome that really lay out those differences. One is the Colosseum. The next one is the Circus Maximus, which was an arena that housed 200,000 people where they would do chariot races. Another building that's really important in Rome is the Pantheon. Remember, that one it's got that temple front pediment, so it looks like a Greek structure on the front, but inside of it, it's huge and could hold a 160-foot sphere. And also, we can't ignore that Roman art and architecture a lot of times involves aqueducts, which are great engineering feat to bring water in from up to 30 miles away. This next section, there's several key figures you would need to know about ancient Rome. One, Hannibal is not even Roman. He's Carthaginian, but he's the general that invades in the Second Punic War, uses elephants. Moving on, we get to Cincinnatus. Remember, Cincinnatus is at the plow. They come out and ask him to lead the Roman forces. He's a Roman general. He wins the war, returns back to his farm, doesn't become a dictator. Julius Caesar becomes a dictator and wants to be dictator for life or emperor for life, and then he is stabbed on the floor of the Senate because of that. A civil war follows, and then we have Caesar Augustus becomes the first emperor in the Pax Romana. Diocletian is an important emperor to remember because, remember, he splits the empire into the Eastern or Byzantine Empire and the Western Roman Empire, which retains its capital in Rome. And finally, you've got Constantine, who makes two important decisions. One is to move the empire to Constantinople, and the other is to allow Christianity to exist and be legalized in the Roman Empire. When comparing the classical civilizations, all of them take place in the Mediterranean world, so the Mediterranean Sea is in the middle, center of this map, basically. And looking at our three different empires, the Persian Empire is all to the east of the Mediterranean, but remember, the Persians never conquered Greece. And so if you're looking at a map, the farthest west they go is almost to Greece, but not there. The Greek Empire with Alexander the Great conquers the Persians, so he takes over all of their land. But of course, Alexander is from Macedonia, which is in northern Greece. So anytime you see a map that also contains all of Greece, it's probably the Empire of Alexander the Great. And finally, the Roman Empire encompasses all the land around the Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean means our inland lake is what they referred to it as. So they went from as far north as England with Hadrian's Wall, Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Judea, Egypt, all across North Africa. All of that was the Roman Empire during the Pax Romana.
Okay, as we talk about factors that led to the fall of Rome, to set up the fall of Rome, we first have to look at some pretty good times for Rome, and that comes with our vocab term, the Pax Romana. So Pax Romana, literally the peace of Rome or Roman peace, is a 200-year period from Caesar Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, where Rome is very stable. It doesn't mean they don't have war. It doesn't mean they're completely peaceful, but there are some factors that allow, even with some outside threats, there to be pretty stable conditions in the empire and quite a bit of peace and prosperity. So if we look at our map and our pictures up here, we can actually see one of the big sources of this prosperity is the Roman roads. So Roman roads are guarded by Roman legions. As you see over my shoulder here, the Roman legions are going to patrol the roads, keep them safe, keep the empire safe from invasion, from barbarians and other outside attacks. But because the Roman legions are able to travel on the 50,000 miles of Roman roads fairly safely and quickly, they're able to keep the barbarians and other threats back while trade and other things flourish on these roads. So the roads are going to provide very good economic benefit because of trade, but they're also going to allow for cultural diffusion, right? We know that with trade comes cultural diffusion. Ideas are going to be transferred just as much as trade goods on the Roman roads. And so all of this is going to set up the golden age or the Pax Romana of the Roman Empire, with trade and wealth coming into the empire, with ideas coming in, fostering new technologies, with religious beliefs. When we talk about Christianity coming up, Christianity travels on these roads. So in general, we have these all-weather roads guarded by the Roman legions, and because of this extensive network, we get the Pax Romana, this 200-year period of peace and prosperity that allows Rome to thrive. But as we have talked about, it also does set up some of the conditions that lead to the fall of Rome. And the Pax Romana is that golden age right before the fall of Rome, where we start to see the cracks appear in the Roman Empire and some of the flaws that are going to set it up for the fall. So we said Pax Romana, a lot of trade was going on, but that's a two-edged sword. Trade brings wealth and prosperity, but it also brings some problems. So coming from all of the different regions that are connected to Rome, the Afro-Eurasia trade routes, the Roman Empire is going to bring in cheap grain. They're going to bring in slaves from almost every part of the empire. And these are actually, while they might sound good, they turn out to be some negatives that are going to help crumble Rome from within. So you think about cheap grain pouring in from Egypt and Sicily and other places. When the grain comes in, it's just like we talk about in our government class, supply and demand. You get all this cheap grain coming in. Well, guess what it does to the market? It floods it with cheap grain. And so the Roman farmers who are trying to make a living, it erodes the price of grain within the empire so that the Roman farmers themselves, the poor Roman farmers, can't compete with the cheap grain. So there are some wealthy patrician farmers who have basically like a plantation called a latifundia. That plantation is going to use slave labor from the slaves coming from the empire's conquest. And so with slave labor, that is also going to further drive down the price of grain. You got cheap grain coming in from Egypt and other places, and then you got cheap grain being produced on these large plantations, the latifundia, by the patricians that have large plantations using slave labor that they get from the conquest. And so the poorer, lower class plebeian Roman farmers can't compete, so they're going to have to sell their land. They're going to sell themselves into debt slavery because they get debt, which actually sets up some of the feudal system coming up in the Middle Ages. And so within society, many people are losing their farms as far as poor farmers. And so they're going to either go and work for the larger farmers, or they're going to go to the cities looking for work, which is what sets up some of these mobs and some of these restless groups of people who are just looking for economic stability. They're looking for jobs. They're looking for some way to provide for themselves. But it is that trade that, while it seems good at first, is bringing a lot of wealth and flourishing to Rome, it also brings in that cheap grain and that slave labor that is helping to erode Roman society and put Romans out of work. So that is another factor that is going to lead to a weakness in the plebeian class, division between the wealthy patricians and plebeians, going to cause controversy and rioting, which again then also is going to lead to that concept of bread and circuses, where the Roman leadership is trying to distract the working class and the poor people from all their problems that are going on in the late Roman Empire. Okay, so as we continue talking about reasons why Rome fell, over my shoulder we have another weakening point. And so when we look at the images behind me, we've got the statues which represent Emperor Diocletian and his co-emperor Maximian. They are going to end up splitting the empire, and as you look at the map over my shoulder here, this shows that Rome will be split into two halves. We'll have the Western Roman Empire, which is centered at Rome, and we'll have the Eastern Roman Empire, will eventually be centered at Constantinople. Originally it's called Byzantium, but Emperor Constantine is going to rename it Constantinople and move the entire government seat for Rome to the east. But Diocletian decides to split the empire because it's become so large and unmanageable, and there's so many problems that he believes that we need co-emperors. So him and Maximian, these two statues over here above me, Diocletian will split the empire and share leadership of it with Maximian.
One of our essay questions asks that we know, how does Cincinnatus, who was a Roman general, leaves the plow, fights off their enemies, is made dictator, gives back the dictatorship, and returns home in 15 days. He becomes the ideal model for a citizen in the Roman Republic. It means he wants a smaller and smaller government, and only a dictator if you have to have one. He sets that model that when Julius Caesar comes along, and in 44 BC, he tries to make himself the emperor for life, he is stabbed on the Senate because he is trying to take too much power, and that ideal of Cincinnatus is being destroyed by Caesar. One last area to be really good at is understanding the government of the Roman Republic. Rome was made up of two main social classes. Patricians were the wealthier, noble, land-holding, richer classes, upper class folks, and then plebeians or plebeians was the lower class people, and from that patrician class came the government. So they had a senate of 300, and then they divided up the power of, similar to the presidency, they had a consul, and that person was in charge of sort of like the executive, like the president. But then they also had two of them because they wanted to divide up that power, and each of them could veto the other one, because in the Roman Republic they really feared giving any one person too much power.